just actually, just by way of introduction, I was just reflecting I've had two incarnations actually with DFID. The first one was I worked in Lesotho for a financial management training team for 5 years in the early 90s. At that stage, DFID didn't trust the Lesotho government with any of their money, but they were very happy to send a training team to help Lesotho manage their money better. I then went from Lesotho. Am I pushing that button here? I then went to Lesotho to Laos in Southeast Asia, where the Swedes had already given, in a sense, budget support to Laos in the mid-90s, and they were suddenly got slightly cold feet that they'd given the money and they weren't quite sure where the money had gone to, and they wanted some people to go and check up what had happened to the money and that the money was being well used. And then I rejoined DFID in '99, and John sitting in the front row. My first assignment for DFID in '99 was to go to Sierra Leone to try and work out how DFID could give budget support to Sierra Leone. So some of this is not new, but there are elements of it which are new. So what I wanted to do, one of the things we've been grappling with in terms of the report that Gideon mentioned at the beginning is the recommendation. There's a strong recommendation that increased finance needs to be directed at fragile states. But we're trying to address a question, but what happens if people say, well, fragile states can't make use of aid well, and even if they can, it can't be delivered at scale? So that's the question I really want to address. And as Gideon said, I work currently for an entity, a program within ODI called the Budget Strengthening Initiative, and we specifically over the last 5 years have been working within fragile states. So part of what I want to share with you is to answer this question about how aid can be delivered at scale and how it can be made more effective. Just before maybe going on to that is just to maybe just look very briefly and not in any great depth. And obviously there are lots being written on these sorts of things, but I think the point to make is that business as usual is not going to be the answer. Just the aid industry carrying on the way it isn't going to work. Many of you in the audience will be aware of lots of reform projects or programs which have taken place or are taking place, billions of dollars, thousands of projects all over the place. Many of them are either failed projects or projects which appear to have failed but make no impact. Donors' own indicators, whether it's DFID or others, show quite a comprehensive, if you like, failure rate or a lack of success. And often successes come with implementation gaps. In the PFM field, we use PIFA indicators as an indicator of whether PFM systems are going well. But often a PIFA score doesn't tell you whether teachers get paid on time or whether drugs get to the clinic on time. They tell you something, but they don't tell you the whole story. We also talk a lot about the literature about reform champions, but we don't often talk about distributed agents who often implement things, implement change. I think if you take a country like Ethiopia or Rwanda, where you've got a very strong leadership, maybe things can be translated into action very well. But in other countries, of which there are many fragile states in that country, just because you have a reform champion doesn't necessarily mean that things get done and happen on the ground. And you get this thing that in the literature, people like Matt Andrews and Matt Pritchard talk about, is you get form but not function. So you get the form of what might appear to be a functioning system, but when you look at what the system produces, it doesn't produce what you expect it to do. So point is, business as usual is not the answer. One part of the answer is about partnerships. I was glad that Natalie, I think, made this point about working collectively. I just wanted to flag a couple of things. I mean, there's some really interesting things going on around the world in terms of partnerships between different groupings, whether it's the private sector, government and NGOs. One of the things that we've been involved in, our main country focus is South Sudan, DRC and Liberia, but we've also been doing some very interesting work in Uganda on transparency, getting the budget out onto a website linked with a call centre, and that's very much a collaborative venture between the government of Uganda, ourselves as providing some of the support, and an NGO network that's also doing some of the randomised control trial to make sure it's working. I think it's important to create platforms for partnership, because I think it's bringing them into fruition, and all different partners and parties can bring different skills and perspectives and inputs to the process. And the other critical point just at the bottom is supporting the government to rightfully lead the process. We sometimes put massive expectations on government without giving them any corresponding assistance. One of my most memorable meetings, international meetings I went to, was in Paris. It was an OECD meeting it was a PFM working group, and we were discussing about how to support financial transfers to developing countries. And one of the recommendations that was being made, well, if a recipient country had a common format and all donor agencies worked to that common format, it would simplify things at the recipient country end. And one of the bilateral donors put their hand up and said, but if we worked that way, that would mean that we as a bilateral donor would have to complete 40 different templates. That would be impossible for us to do. We don't have the capacity. The chair just reminded her that actually the problem that recipient countries face was exactly that, getting reporting in multiple formats which they had to try and translate into their budget process and reporting processes. So we need to find a way to make partnerships work. In terms of the budget strengthening initiative, this is what we're about. As well as actually working in the 3 countries, we have a strategic arrangement with Helder and his team. We provide some support to the G7+ Secretariat in Timor-Leste as well. But our primary focus in terms of fragile states is with the 3 programs that we have in South Sudan, Liberia and DRC. We describe ourselves as an arm's length actor working in support of and together with our partners. We are funded, our initial funding came from DFID, we've now currently got funding from CEDA and others, but we work with government partners. We don't work on behalf of the donor community, and so we work within the ministry, inside the ministry. And the way we assist them is through, the objective is to make them more effective and transparent and accountable, and we do that through a variety of things: tailored research, expert policy advice, but also hands-on assistance. Because I think one of the things that we've found, particularly in fragile states, is although they value policy advice, often what they really need is help in implementation. It's when the IMF leave the country and fly out on the Friday that it's on the Monday morning that often people need some help in terms of understanding what the IMF were talking about and how to translate it and implement it. So what we've found over the last 5 years or so is that actually help with implementation is often what's required. Now let me just go into a little bit more detail, just giving Liberia as an example. We started off our support in Liberia primarily supporting the medium-term expenditure framework back in 2010-2011. The support's continued in Liberia, but it's now a broader form of support to the budget department, working on processes, helping them engage constructively with the legislature, engaging with other government ministries, and also engaging on a broader set of transparency issues. Liberia is one of those countries that's produced quite a neat citizens' guide to the budget, which we provided them some support on. And latterly, we've been providing support and assistance on revenue, support on tax policy and forecasting, and also on natural resources within the newly formed Revenue Authority. One of the pieces of work for the Revenue Authority is helping the Liberians assess taxation and audit the taxation of large companies like Firestone and some of the forestry companies who are operating in Liberia. It's built on a relationship of trust. It's often about, in this case in Liberia, improving the connectivity between revenue and expenditure, looking at how to increase revenue in the natural resources sector, improving forecasting. Although we call ourselves a budget strengthening initiative, often some of the weaknesses in the countries in which we work are not so much in the budget, but in terms of managing the cash that they have. Often the budget doesn't necessarily always mean much in reality, but improved forecasting, both revenue forecasting and improving the budget, can critically help and is important in cash management. And the other thing we've done a lot of help work in Liberia with, and also in South Sudan and elsewhere, is ensuring that you get aid onto budget to improve allocation. decisions. The story we heard from the Ministry of Finance in Liberia was that when he had the Ministry of Health in front of him, this was pre-Ebola, he was able to say to the Ministry of Health, well, we know you're asking for so much money from the government, but we also know that you are getting additional resources from either donor agencies or elsewhere, which are also supplementing your budget. So therefore, we don't think you need as much state resource because you're getting resources from elsewhere. And in terms of allocating national resources, that's important that you know the broader picture. I think this first point on this slide is, I mean, Natalie, this ties up with some of what you were saying. I'm not sure if the state building contract in Liberia is live, but I think one of the things that we feel we're doing in terms of working on technical assistance in Liberia is it will help facilitate and maybe make the progress and implementation of the state building contract more effective. So that may not be an actual fact, it may still be in the future, but certainly we have been working on the TA side on that. I think it's the point which complements what Natalie was saying. It's about system strengthening alongside financial inflows. Financial inflows are important, but you need to strengthen the systems. We're also looking in Liberia at deconcentration possibilities. There's lots of possibilities for doing that and for scaling up in that area and creating broader platforms for that. And although it's early days in Liberia, it mirrors some of what we've done in South Sudan, which is where we have a much bigger program. But again, as Natalie said, some of the work we've been doing in terms of providing capacity building support to the Ministry of Finance means the possibility of South Sudan, despite all the problems that South Sudan has, acquiring state building support was much greater. And the other point just to make in South Sudan as well, the team there has worked quite hard and in a complementary way to the World Bank. So some of the money that's come into South Sudan through the World Bank for the local government state program, state development program of $50 million has been again facilitated by BSI work in terms of capacity building. This is my last slide, so I think we're okay on time. So, some emerging lessons. I think personally there's enormous potential to improve the results of government spending. I think some of the statistics being bandied around, I think it's in the State of Fragility report by the OECD, there's $50 billion worth of aid to fragile states, and we think it could be used much more effectively. I think it's about complementarity. We're not saying that our way of providing technical assistance is superior to anyone else's, but we think we can work in a complementary way to others, and I think it's about working collectively. We need to invest in partnerships now to create the infrastructure, both in terms of investing in capacity and helping governments manage demand much better. There's a nice phrase that Professor Paul Collier used, which is, I think he uses the phrase, to invest in investing. And I think a lot of what BSI is doing is investing in countries to help them manage their investments much better. We haven't talked a lot about this, but one of the very distinctive things we do is we have a focus on problems. We don't necessarily work to a strict roadmap, but we have a very strict problem focus at inception and work along with that. So that's how the work in Liberia has evolved from a very tight focus on the MTEF to a broader set of capacity building support to budget, and also responding to government requests to work on revenue. And the other point I want to make is don't be narrow. It's important to work with others and to build alliances. And actually, Gideon, I wasn't actually telling the truth because I've got one more slide, sorry. So my answer to the question, can we scale up in fragile states? My answer is yes, we can. In terms of going back into my own history, I think one of the good things we did actually in Lesotho was we worked from the Ministry of Finance across sector ministries. We made sure the central ministries were outward looking and engaged in the real issues. So that's one lesson from Lesotho in the early 90s, which is still pertinent today. In terms of Laos, we were embedded within the Department of Forestry with the government, working to a national agenda. It was about changing the incentives, the way the Laos saw the money. Giving money, giving budget support makes people see it as our money rather than donor money. And I think once they see it as our money, they use it in a slightly different way. And I think that's an important lesson too. Let's not see resources as an entitlement, but a response to positive and observed changes. One of the problems with the aid industry is it allocates money often to countries, and this is one of the things I did when I was at DFID, we allocated money through the bilateral aid review to countries. Not necessarily, it was very much supply driven, not necessarily driven totally by the demands and requirements of the country. Work collectively, make the connections, we're not in competition, but we can be much more effective when we cooperate and don't compete. And final point is building in adaptation and learning as we go along.